January 30th, 1933. Berlin. Asterisk, asterisk. The winter air hung thick with coal smoke and anticipation. In the Reich Chancellery, a man with a small mustache and burning eyes placed his hand on a leather-bound document, swearing an oath that would reshape the world. Outside, torchlight processions snaked through the streets like rivers of fire. The crowd roared. They could not know, none of them could know, that this moment was a doorway, and through it, humanity might pass into darkness or light. History, in that instant, balanced on a knife's edge. What they celebrated was a beginning. What we must understand is how close it came to being our ending. Adolf Hitler had become Chancellor of Germany. Within weeks, the Reichstag would burn. Within months, democracy would die. Within years, Europe would ignite. But in the smoking ruins of what might have been, there exists another timeline, one whispered about in classified American war rooms, one modeled by British intelligence analysts in the desperate years of 1940 and 1941, one that haunted the dreams of every soldier who stormed the beaches of Normandy. It is the timeline where the swastika did not fall, where the eagle and the rising sun divided the world between them, where the Third Reich stood triumphant, and the thousand-year darkness Hitler promised actually came to pass. This is not fantasy. This is the alternate history they warned us about. The architects of American strategy understood the fragility of victory long before the first shot was fired. In the summer of 1940, with France fallen and Britain besieged, President Franklin Roosevelt convened his military advisors in the map room of the White House. The map spread before them showed a world painted in hostile colors. General George Marshall stood before those maps and spoke words that would be classified for decades. "Gentlemen, we are looking at the possibility of fighting this war alone, from our own shores, against an enemy that controls all of Europe and half of Asia. If Britain falls, we face not just defeat, but extinction as a free nation." The fear was not abstract. It was mathematical. It was geographical. It was terrifyingly real. Consider the turning points, those hinges of fate upon which everything swung. The Battle of Britain in 1940. If the Luftwaffe had maintained its attacks on RAF airfields instead of switching to cities, fighter command would have collapsed within 2 weeks. British analysts after the war confirmed this. The island would have been defenseless. Operation Sea Lion, the German invasion plan, would have proceeded. Britain would have fallen by October 1940, not in some dramatic Götterdämmerung, but in a slow strangulation of air superiority and naval blockade. Churchill would have fled to Canada or been captured. The king might have negotiated. The Royal Navy would have scattered or scuttled itself. And America would have faced Hitler's Europe alone, across an ocean suddenly far more vast and deadly than it had ever been. In this other world, in this shadow timeline, German soldiers stood on the white cliffs of Dover in November 1940, looking west across the Atlantic, where their Führer's ambitions now turned with single-minded intensity. Or consider the frozen hell of December 1941, outside Moscow. The Wehrmacht stood 12 miles from the Kremlin. Soviet resistance seemed ready to shatter, like ice under a hammer. German commanders reported that one more push, one more week of favorable weather, and the city would fall. Stalin had already ordered his government to evacuate to Kuibyshev. In our timeline, the Russian winter came early and brutal, freezing German tanks and men alike, giving the Red Army time to bring Siberian divisions west for a counteroffensive that would begin the long Nazi retreat. But weather is chance. Weather is chaos. In the alternate timeline, the winter holds off for 10 more days. The Wehrmacht takes Moscow on December 15, 1941. Stalin dies in the bombardment or flees east of the Urals. The Soviet Union fractures into chaos. German panzers drive south to the Caucasus oil fields unopposed. By spring 1942, the swastika flies from Brest to the Pacific and 40 million more souls are under Nazi dominion. The German soldiers who might have achieved these victories expected triumph. They had been promised it in every speech, every radio broadcast, every propaganda film. They were told they were the master race, destined to rule, inheritors of an empire that would last a millennium. What they did not expect, What no amount of propaganda could prepare them for was the industrial colossus they would have awakened in trying to conquer it all. But in the world where Hitler won, that awakening never came. Not in time. Not in the way it mattered. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor occurred in both timelines, on December 7, 1941. But the America that responded would have been vastly different in a world where Britain had fallen and Russia had collapsed. Instead of fighting a two-front war with powerful allies, the United States would have faced the Axis powers alone, across two oceans, with enemies controlling nearly three-quarters of the world's industrial capacity and resources. The mathematics of such a war are grim. American war planners knew this. In classified documents from 1940, the Joint Chiefs outlined hemisphere defense scenarios that assumed Fortress America, a defensive perimeter running from Greenland to Brazil, with the U.S. fleet split between oceans, incapable of projecting power across either. In this darker world, Admiral Yamamoto's gamble at Pearl Harbor succeeded beyond his imagination. Not just 6 battleships damaged or destroyed, but the aircraft carriers Enterprise, Lexington, Saratoga, caught in harbor and sent to the bottom. The Pacific Fleet obliterated in a single morning. And 6 months later, with no Battle of Midway to turn the tide, Japanese carriers roamed the Pacific unopposed. Australia fell by late 1942. India rose in rebellion against British colonial rule, aided by Japanese arms and promises of liberation. The rising sun flag flew from Sydney to Ceylon, from the Philippines to Hawaii. Yes, Hawaii. In the shadow timeline, the Japanese returned in 1943 with an invasion force, and without carriers, without a Pacific fleet, there was no force to stop them. The islands fell in a campaign that lasted 6 weeks. Japanese soldiers walked the streets of Honolulu, hauled down the American flag from Iolani Palace, and raised their own. The western defensive perimeter of the United States became the California coast. And German U-boats, operating from captured bases in Iceland and the Azores, turned the Atlantic into a killing ground where American shipping died by the hundreds. The symbolic object in this narrative, the object that represents what was at stake, was not a weapon or a sound. It was wheat. American wheat. Golden, abundant, the product of vast prairies and mechanized farming, the food that had fed the world in one war and would do so again. In our timeline, American wheat arrived in Britain by the convoy load, keeping the island alive through the darkest years. It fed Soviet soldiers on the Eastern Front through Lend-Lease, millions of tons shipped through Murmansk and Vladivostok. It fed liberated France and Italy and the Netherlands. It was the quiet symbol of American abundance, of a democracy that could produce not just weapons but life itself, that could fight a war and still feed allies an ocean away. In the world where Hitler won, that wheat rotted in silos in Kansas and Iowa. There was nowhere to send it, no allies to feed. And as the war dragged on, as the fortress mentality took hold, American agriculture turned inward, rationing became permanent, and the abundance that had defined the nation withered like crops in a drought. The transformation this would have wrought on the American psyche is almost unimaginable. The United States in 1941 still remembered isolation, still carried the wounds of the Depression, still debated whether the world's problems were its problems. But it also believed in its own potential, its own righteousness, its own inevitable triumph. The generation that fought World War II expected to win because they were Americans, and Americans did not lose. This was not mere arrogance. It was an identity forged over a century and a half of expansion and success. Imagine that identity shattered. Imagine an America that fights for 5 years, 10 years, and watches the world fall anyway. Britain occupied. Russia destroyed. China subjugated. The entire Eurasian landmass under totalitarian control. American boys dying in Iceland, in Panama, in Alaska, in desperate defensive campaigns against enemies that never stopped coming. The aircraft carriers that would have been built, the hundreds of ships and thousands of planes, deployed not to liberate Europe but to defend Seattle and San Diego. Victory not as liberation, but as mere survival. The documented evidence of how close this came to reality is chilling. German intelligence files captured after the war showed detailed invasion plans for Iceland, completed in 1941. The Kriegsmarine had prepared Operation Icarus, the seizure of Iceland, to cut the Atlantic supply line. Only the invasion of Russia postponed it. In the alternate timeline, with no Eastern Front to bleed Wehrmacht resources, Icarus proceeds in spring 1942. Iceland falls. The Atlantic becomes impassable. Britain, already on starvation rations, collapses by summer. The Duke of Windsor, who had shown Nazi sympathies before the war, returns from exile to head a puppet government. King George VI dies in mysterious circumstances. The British Empire dissolves not in post-war independence movements, but in immediate Nazi partition. India, Burma, Malaya, all offered to Japan as spoils. Canada stands alone, waiting for the inevitable. The emotional contrast between expectation and reality would have been most acute in that moment when America realized it could not win. Not surrender. The United States was too vast, too defensible, too armed to be conquered outright. But victory, the triumphant crushing of evil, the liberation of Europe and Asia, the restoration of freedom, that dream would die somewhere around 1944, in the grim calculus of casualties and resources and strategic impossibility. President Roosevelt, in this timeline, perhaps dies not from cerebral hemorrhage in April 1945, but from despair a year earlier, watching the maps, seeing the slow contraction of the free world down to one hemisphere, one continent, one last fortress. What the American soldiers in this timeline would have experienced, the ones fighting in the Aleutians in Central America, in the waters off Greenland, was not the righteous crusade of our history, but a bitter defensive struggle where victory meant only surviving another year. They were told they fought for freedom and democracy. What they saw was freedom shrinking month by month, democracy becoming a luxury of the besieged. The letters they wrote home, the diaries they kept, would have been documents of slow disillusionment, of men who marched off expecting to be heroes and found themselves merely survivors. The ideological transformation this would have wrought goes beyond politics into the realm of philosophy and faith. America defined itself in opposition to tyranny. It was the city on a hill, the last best hope, the place where freedom was not just an idea but a lived reality. In a world where the tyrants won, where Nazi Germany ruled Europe and Imperial Japan ruled Asia, where the future belonged to fascism and militarism and racial hierarchies, what would America be? A holdout, a remnant, a memory of something that once seemed inevitable but turned out to be fragile as glass. Hitler understood this. In speeches throughout the 1930s and early 1940s, he spoke of the Jewish plutocratic powers, by which he meant Britain and America, as decadent, weak, divided by class and race and ideology, incapable of the unity and will that characterized the Nazi state. He believed democracies could not fight total war, could not sustain casualties, could not make the sacrifices that totalitarian systems could demand. In our timeline, he was catastrophically wrong. The democracies outproduced, outfought, and outlasted him. But his error was not inevitable. It was the result of specific decisions, specific battles, specific moments of fortune that could have fallen differently. The Battle of Midway in June 1942 was one such moment. Japanese Admiral Nagumo had 4 fleet carriers. American Admiral Fletcher had 3. The battle was decided by dive bombers finding the Japanese carriers in a 10-minute window when they were most vulnerable, refueling aircraft on deck, bombs and torpedoes exposed. Those 10 minutes changed the Pacific War. In the alternate timeline, American dive bombers arrive 15 minutes later. The Japanese carriers launch their strike. They find and destroy the American carriers. The balance of power in the Pacific shifts permanently. There is no Guadalcanal, no island-hopping campaign, no march across the ocean to Tokyo. Instead, there is a slow retreat, a defensive perimeter that cannot hold, and eventually a negotiated peace that leaves Japan in control of the Pacific and a vast Asian empire built on the bones of 30 million Chinese dead. The recurring wheat returns here as symbol and reality. In the occupied territories of the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, Japan's Orwellian name for its conquered empire, rice was requisitioned, population starved, and the only food that might have saved millions rotted and used in American silos. In German-occupied Europe, the same. Ukrainian grain, Polish agriculture, French farms, all turned to feeding the Wehrmacht in German cities while occupied populations died of hunger. 7 million Soviets starved in the siege of Leningrad alone in our timeline. In the timeline where Germany won, where the war ended not in liberation but in armistice, the death toll from hunger would have reached 50 million. Maybe more. And American wheat, which might have fed them, which did feed them in the years after 1945, remained locked away, symbol of an abundance that could not be shared because the world had fallen into darkness. The German soldiers who occupied Moscow, who paraded through Trafalgar Square, who raised the swastika over the Kremlin and Buckingham Palace, believed they were creating a new order. They were told it would bring peace, a German peace, where Slavs would be slaves and Jews would not exist, and the Aryan race would rule in racial purity for 1,000 years. Some believed this. Most simply followed orders, fought for comrades, endured the cold and fear and occasional moments of triumph that are the universal experience of soldiers. But what none of them expected, what the propaganda never prepared them for, was the hollowness of their victory. Because the alternate history does not end in 1945 with a German-Japanese peace. It continues into a darker, stranger world. The Nazi Empire was built on slavery and murder. It could conquer, but could it endure? The classified studies done by the OSS and later the CIA in the late 1940s and 1950s, examining this very question, concluded it could not. Not in the long term. Not even in the medium term. The economics were impossible. Germany would have had to garrison an empire of 400 million hostile people from France to the Urals, while extracting resources to pay for the garrisons, while fighting perpetual partisan wars, while maintaining racial hierarchies that made efficient governance impossible. The whole system would have required continuous brutality, continuous repression, continuous fear. It was not a sustainable model of civilization. It was a machine that could only run on blood. And eventually, it would have run out. The Japanese Empire faced the same contradictions. It had conquered for resources, oil, rubber, rice, metals. But conquest did not create resources. It only spread the Japanese military thinner, created more resistance, required more brutality. The Great Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere was propaganda. The reality was exploitation and repression, and it generated the seeds of its own destruction in the resistance movements it spawned. So the alternate history, if followed forward, does not end in perpetual Nazi rule. It ends in slow collapse. The Third Reich fractures in the 1950s into competing military districts as Hitler dies and his subordinates fight for succession. Civil wars erupt across occupied Europe. The Japanese Empire faces rebellion in China, Korea, Southeast Asia. And America, watching from across its oceans, remains isolated, armed, bitter, a democracy turned fortress state, nursing its wounds and its resentments, waiting. But the psychological damage would have been permanent. The generation that grew up in that timeline, the children of the 1950s and 1960s, would have known a world where fascism won, where democracy failed, where the ideals of freedom and human rights were luxuries that could not withstand tanks and dive bombers and the ruthless application of force. They would have grown up cynical in ways our generation cannot imagine. The optimism that characterized post-war America in our timeline, the sense of unlimited possibility, the belief that progress was inevitable and justice would triumph, none of that would exist in the world where Hitler won. Instead, there would be a grimmer wisdom, a recognition that civilization is fragile, that evil can win, at least for a time, that the arc of history does not naturally bend toward justice, it bends where we force it to bend, and if we fail to apply that force, it bends into darkness. The epilogue of this shadow history is written not in what happened, but in what did not happen. The GI Bill that educated a generation, the Marshall Plan that rebuilt Europe, the United Nations, imperfect but real, where nations could settle disputes without war. The Civil Rights Movement, born in part from the recognition that a nation could not fight fascism abroad while tolerating racism at home. the prosperity and innovation and culture that defined the American century. None of it in the world where Hitler won. Just survival. Just endurance. Just the slow, grinding wait for the totalitarian empires to collapse under their own weight. And the wheat? The American wheat that in our timeline fed a starving world and became a symbol of democratic abundance? In that other world, it became a symbol of isolation, of plenty hoarded while millions starved, of a nation that had the power to feed the world but no longer had the world to feed. The silos stood full while the granaries of Europe lay empty. The symbol transformed from generosity to grief. This is what they warned us about. Not in propaganda or speculation, but in sober analysis. The classified war games run at the Naval War College in Newport. The scenario planning done by the Joint Chiefs. The midnight fears of Roosevelt and Churchill and Stalin, each in his own way understanding that the war could be lost, that the forces of darkness were not inevitable losers but powerful, organized, and terrifyingly capable of victory. We remember World War II as the good war, the war we had to fight, the war we won. We remember D-Day and Midway, and the fall of Berlin. We remember liberation, not conquest. Victory, not survival. We remember it as a war between good and evil where good triumphed because that is what happened. But it is not what had to happen. It was contingent, fragile, dependent on 1,000 factors that could have fallen differently. The men who stormed Omaha Beach on June 6, 1944, were not guaranteed to succeed. They could have been slaughtered on the sand, the invasion could have failed, and the war could have ground on for years with no second front, no liberation, no victory in Europe. The pilots who flew off carriers at Midway were not destined to find the Japanese fleet at the perfect moment. They could have missed, run out of fuel, returned to find their own carrier sunk. History is made of such moments, and the moments are made of chance and courage, and 1,000 small decisions that accumulate into fate. The alternate history where Hitler won is a reminder of how close we came to that fate. How narrow the margin was. How easily it could have been us living in that darker world, looking back at the turning points, the battles lost, the invasions failed, the Allies fallen, and wondering what we might have done differently. It is also a reminder of what was fought for. Not just territory or resources or national pride, but the very possibility of a world where democracy could survive, where freedom was not a historical curiosity but a living reality, where the future belonged not to those who could impose their will through force, but to those who believed that human beings had the right to choose their own destiny. The Third Reich promised order. It delivered chaos. It promised strength. It delivered oppression. It promised a 1,000-year empire. It lasted 12 years and died in flames and rubble, and the revelation of horrors so profound that the human race is still processing them 8 decades later. The alternate history where it lasted longer, where it conquered more, where it stood triumphant over the ruins of its enemies, is a history of deeper horrors, longer darkness, and a world that would have taken centuries to recover, if it recovered at all. We did not live that history. We lived this one. The one where the farmers of Kansas sent their wheat to Liverpool and Murmansk, where American factories outproduced the world, where soldiers who expected to be heroes were given the chance to become them, where democracy proved it could fight total war and win, where the tyrants fell and their empires crumbled, and the idea that all people are created equal, however imperfectly realized, survived to be passed on to another generation. But the shadow history remains. Not as fantasy, but as warning. As a reminder that the victory was not inevitable. That it had to be fought for, died for, won through courage and sacrifice and, yes, enormous amounts of American wheat shipped across dangerous oceans to keep allies alive. The torches that burned in Berlin on January 30th, 1933, marked a beginning. In our timeline, they marked the beginning of the end for the Third Reich, though it would take 12 years and 60 million dead to reach that end. In the alternate timeline, they marked the beginning of a darkness that would have lasted generations. The difference between the two timelines is measured not just in battles and policies, but in the accumulated weight of individual choices, individual courage, individual moments when someone stood when they might have fled, fought when they might have surrendered, believed in victory when all evidence suggested defeat. This is the history they warned us about. This is the alternate world that existed as possibility, as potential, as the shadow that hung over every war room and every battlefield. It did not happen, but it could have. And in the space between what happened and what might have happened, we find the measure of what was saved, what was fought for, what was worth the terrible price that was paid. The wheat stands golden in the fields. The ships cross the oceans. The flag flies. Not because these things are guaranteed, but because they were defended. Not because victory was inevitable, but because it was achieved. The darkness was real. The threat was existential. And the triumph, when it came, was earned in ways that echo across generations, a reminder that freedom is never more than one generation away from extinction, and every generation must choose to preserve it. They warned us what would happen if Hitler won. They showed us the maps where darkness covered the earth. They ran the scenarios where America stood alone and slowly fell. They understood the stakes in ways that transcended politics or propaganda. It was civilizational. It was a question of what kind of world would exist for the children not yet born. We live in the answer to that question. The answer is written in the ruins of Berlin and the trials at Nuremberg and the post-war order that, for all its flaws, prevented the darkness from returning. The answer is written in the fact that we can look back at that alternate history as a nightmare avoided rather than a reality endured. And the wheat, the American wheat, symbol of abundance and democracy, feeds the world still. Not as charity but as connection, as the product of a civilization that chose to produce rather than merely conquer, to share rather than merely hoard, to build a world where there would be enough for all rather than an empire, where plenty was reserved for the chosen few. This is what they warned us about. This is what was prevented. This is why we remember.